Hello everybody, and welcome to our latest look at women in history. We're looking now at two women, both of whom were called Mary, and they were actually mother and daughter. In our recent studies, we've been looking at women who are still unknown to most people, blue stockings and female scientists. This time we're going to look at two very famous women indeed. Mary Wollstonecraft, who's been called the first modern feminist, and her even more famous daughter, the author of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. No one could have foreseen at the time of her birth when Mary Wollstonecraft would achieve. She was born on the 27th of April 1759 in Spitalfields in East London. Spitalfields was famous for its silk weavers, and Mary's grandfather, the founder of the family fortunes, had been one. Her father, Edward, inherited a share of the business, but considered himself a gentleman and above such mundane things as trade. He married Elizabeth, who came from an Irish wine merchant family, and they had a son, Ned, and then Mary. According to a later account, her parents gave her a harsh upbringing, and she seemed to have acquired a chip on her shoulder right from the start. She was put out to a wet nurse, and this accounted, she thought, for the fact that the relationship with her mother was so distant. Later, she was to become a strong advocate of breastfeeding. A mother who didn't suckle her children scarcely deserved the name, she thought. Mary was conscious from the beginning that she was not her parents' favourite. While Ned was coddled, she was ignored or made to sit still for hours. When she was 6, things got worse. Under the terms of her grandfather's will, her brother got a large legacy, including a share of ownership in a ship. She got nothing. Her grandfather didn't even know her name. Already she was beginning to learn that it was a man's world, and women counted for little or nothing. Her father now moved the family to Essex, where he set up as a gentleman farmer. He was not a success. Indeed, he wasn't very successful at anything he did, which perhaps accounted for his bad temper and heavy drinking. Sometimes he showed fondness for his daughter, sometimes cruelty, but he was the domestic tyrant, and his mother and daughter the slaves. Mary grew up thinking this was what normal family life was like, and she came to despise the conventional idea of marriage, based on power rather than love. She found herself having to protect her mother from her father's violence, because her mother would never fight back. And she conceived the idea that the patriarchal nature of society was not entirely the fault of men. It was equally the fault of women. They meekly accepted their role in things. They were just too weak. The Wollstonecrafts went on to have more children, 7 all told. They were continually moving about the country, and although the eldest brother, Ned, got a proper education to prepare him for the bar, Mary got little or nothing. Such as indeed was the force of prejudice, she wrote later. What was called spirit and wit in him was cruelly repressed as forwardness in me. At school in Yorkshire, where she lived between the ages of 9 and 15, she learned to read and write, but that was it. She was to be almost entirely self-taught. Her letters to her friend Jane Arden show she'd acquired some knowledge of literature, particularly poetry, and perhaps already had literary ambitions. She had an even more intense friendship with a girl called Fanny Blood, which may have had erotic overtures, overtones rather. But these teenage years were to come to an abrupt end. Her father's business affairs had taken a turn for the worse, and the family fled to Larne in Wales, probably to escape his creditors, but they must have caught up with them because they returned to London, financially ruined. At the age of 19, Mary would have to fend for herself. The options for a girl with middle-class aspirations had but little education were limited. She gained a post as a lady's companion, living with a rich woman in Bath and later Windsor. Predictably, she hated it. She always hated being dependent on anyone. She couldn't engage in the servile flattery, as she called it, that such a post required, and was incapable of maintaining a demure female reticence and keeping her strong opinions to herself. She looked on at the fashionable world, depressed and alienated. Things got worse. Her mother was gravely ill and called her home. Mary had to nurse her through her final fatal sickness. She felt resentment that her mother still hadn't shown any gratitude or affection for her, even when she was dying. Now she moved in with the Blood family, but her friend Fanny was in poor health. She couldn't stay there. The obvious way out was to get married, but she was too assertive, indeed domineering a personality to attract many suitors, and yet she was offended when no man was prepared to propose to her. Then her younger sister, Eliza, did get married, raising fears that she, Mary, would be left on the shelf as a spinster. After all, she was already 23. But something in Eliza's marriage went wrong. She seemed to have been suffering from what would now be called postnatal depression, and called on Mary to nurse her. Mary moved into the house in Bermondsey and immediately took charge. She soon divined what the matter was, or thought she did. It was all the fault of the husband. He was the same dominating type as her father. So she came up with an extraordinary plan. She would rescue Eliza from her husband and carry her off, leaving her home, and even more extraordinary, her baby behind. To say it wasn't quite thought through would be an understatement, and yet, with the help of Fanny, she carried it out. Mary and Eliza now found themselves trapped in stuffy lodgings without even a change of clothes. Eliza naturally fretted about her baby, as it occurred to them that a wife who abandoned her husband lost the right to her child. They didn't even dare to go outside in case a spy of the husband saw them and Elizabeth was snatched back. Mary, however, was made of stern stuff. The three women would now live together in an all-female establishment, she decided, and maintain themselves by hard work. Needlework and shopkeeping were suggested, but neither of them were up Mary's Street, and eventually they decided to open a school. Mary borrowed money, possibly from her brother, and they set about advertising for pupils. A suitable house was found at Newington Green, and the school actually opened, attracting 20 pupils. Meanwhile, Eliza's baby had died without her ever seeing it again, and she remained permanently separated from her husband, unable, of course, to marry because divorce at that time was impossible without a special act of Parliament. Newington Green contained a circle of dissenters led by the influential Dr. Richard Price. Although she never joined his chapel herself, Price became a sort of father figure to Mary, the real father that she considered she'd never had, confirming her inner belief in reason, liberty, and the importance of education for everybody, especially women. But in the real world, the school she'd founded was failing. She now began to develop literary ambitions. Through an Anglican clergyman, she was introduced to the great Samuel Johnson, then at the very end of his life. This fired her ambitions even more. She planned to write serious works along the lines of the blue-stocking writers, not the silly romantic fiction which women usually wrote, and she despised. Then the school was struck a fatal blow. Fanny decided to marry and move with her new husband to Portugal. Without her teaching, it began to go rapidly downhill. Mary received a letter from her friend in Lisbon describing her woes. She was stuck in a foreign country, ill and pregnant. On an impulse, Mary decided she must go and nurse her. Abandoning the school, she borrowed money, probably from Price, and set off once more for Portugal. After an appalling journey, she arrived in Lisbon in the nick of time. Fanny was already in labour. The baby was born alive, but not for long. Within a few days, both mother and child were dead. Mary grieved for her friend, but she was now stuck in Portugal. She didn't like it. It seemed a sink of Catholic superstition, and the position of women incarcerated in convents even worse than in England. Eventually, after several months, she found a ship to take her home. The voyage this time was even worse. In a storm, her ship came across a French vessel in distress. Its captain pleaded for Mary's ship to take on board the passengers and crew. The captain of Mary's ship said no, it was too risky. Mary was furious. She screamed at him. How dare he neglect the duty of common humanity? He was a disgrace. She'd report him when they got home. The captain quailed before this formidable young woman and agreed to take the French people on board. That was the heroic side of Mary, but there was also the depressive side. Back in England in the winter of 1785, with the school gone and hopelessly in debt, she sank into ill health and apathy. She poured herself out of it by writing. She decided to write a conduct book in the style of the blue-stocking Hester Chaperon. It was called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Most of these books told girls how to be feminine in the conventional sense, to prepare themselves for marriage. Mary rejected all of that. Girls should be taught to be sincere so that they could lead a moral life, not instructed in the deceptions of femininity. Any talk about babies, cosmetics, the theatre, any frivolity or artifice was out. A girl might deign to receive a man's caresses, but should not bestow them. I'm very far from thinking love irresistible, she wrote. Later, as we'll see. Altogether, the book was pervaded by a sense of melancholy. It was aimed at those unfortunate females who are left by inconsiderate parents to struggle with the world, and whose cultivation of mind renders the endeavour doubly painful, i.e. women just like herself. Despite this limited appeal, her clergyman friend, John Hewlett, agreed to help her get it published. Hewlett took it to the famous radical publisher Joseph Johnson, who gave her an advance of 10 guineas and published it early in 1787. It was only a modest success, but excerpts from it were published in the Ladies' Magazine, the biggest-selling women's magazine of the day, and it was praised for its good sense and judicious observations. But it didn't solve her financial problems. She decided she would have to bite the bullet and become that thing dreaded by women in her position, a children's governess. She tried to improve her French and smarten up her clothes to get ready for this change, and through Dr. Price gained the position of governess to 3 of the children of Lord and Lady Kingsborough. She was not looking forward to the prospect. For a start, the Kingsboroughs lived in Ireland, and it would mean mixing with the aristocracy, and through Price's influence she'd come to regard them as frivolous, self-centred and corrupt. She set off in a mood of depression, but at first things went well. She crossed the Irish Sea easily and found that the Kingsboroughs were not at their fashionable Dublin townhouse, but at their country estate in County Cork, Mitchelstown. From her first arrival there, Mary was determined to find fault. The house, although called a castle, was an agreeable, up-to-date Palladian mansion, but she didn't like it. Lord Kingsborough was an enlightened landlord by Irish standards, but hearing he had an eye for governesses, she kept away from him. And she didn't like Lady Kingsborough either, an insolent, condescending woman who talked too much and seemed to prefer her dogs to her children. What her ladyship made of this strange, intimidating young woman is not recorded. Even the children Mary found disagreeable at first, wild and uneducated. She found herself in a lonely position. The Kingsboroughs didn't treat her as a superior servant, as some employers did, but neither could she be treated as their social equal. And she was acutely aware she was intellectually superior to any of them. The only person she grew to like was the 14-year-old eldest daughter, Margaret. When Margaret went down with a violent fever, Mary nursed her back to health, and her attitude to the Kingsboroughs softened slightly, but only slightly. She still longed to get away. When spring came, the Kingsboroughs moved to Dublin, and Mary went with them. But she continued to suffer from what she called palpitations and the vapours. Lady Kingsborough was worried about her and went to great lengths to try to revive her spirits, taking her to concerts and the theatre, and even lending her a costume to go to a masquerade. All to no avail. Mary continued to be depressed, and it didn't help that she discovered Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She read his influential educational novel, Émile, and seems to have fallen half in love with its author. Rousseau was a kindred spirit, she decided, a lonely idealist like herself, self-absorbed, despising social rank and despairing of the reality of life. "I'm half mad," she said, "part Hamlet and part Ophelia." Janet Todd suggests that her real trouble was repressed sexual longing, and this may be so. But the only man she seems to have fancied at this time was already married, and she wasn't prepared to go along that route. She feared that her intellectual superiority would always repel eligible men. Things improved slightly when the Kingsboroughs announced they were going on a continental tour and would take Mary with them. They made a stop at Bristol, and it was here that Mary wrote her second book. It was a novel called Mary, a fiction, and strongly influenced by Rousseau, was about a young woman educating herself through cultivating her feelings, admiring nature and thinking of solitary thoughts. In other words, a novel of sensibility. The fictional Mary was an aristocrat, but otherwise strongly resembled the author, and the other people in the book all resembled her parents and people like Fanny Blood and the Kingsboroughs. It all ends inevitably in seduction and death. By the time she'd finished it, her time with the Kingsboroughs was up. Her ladyship had tried everything she could to help this irritatingly superior young woman, and got no gratitude for it. But it was Mary's influence over her children, particularly Margaret, that was the last straw. There seems to have been a huge quarrel. Mary told her ladyship some home truths she'd been storing up, and Margaret took Mary's side. The enraged Lady Kingsborough sacked her governess on the spot. She was given her wages, but nothing else. What was she going to do? She was 28, without home, money, or employment, tactless, self-absorbed and depressed, but with plenty of energy. She had to find herself a way of earning a living that didn't involve governessing or teaching. She would have to become a professional writer. So she went straight to St Paul's Churchyard, centre of the London book trade, and called on Joseph Johnson. Johnson had a reputation for being cautious and mean, but he was remarkably kind and generous to Mary. He took her home with him and let her pour out all her worries. "Don't despair," he said. "There is something you can do to earn money. Become a professional writer. It's difficult for a woman, but not impossible. And as a first step, I will publish a novel." Mary stayed with him for a few months until he found her suitable lodgings, and she started on a new life. Mary was now in a peculiar position, an unmarried woman being protected by an unmarried man, Johnson. It was something to keep quiet about. She'd cut off almost all contact with her family now, even keeping Eliza at a distance. The problem now was what to write about. She started a second novel and then abandoned it. She decided she should write books for children in the style of the blue-stocking Anna Letitia Barbauld. What she produced was called Original Stories from Real Life. Children of sophisticated aristocrats are rescued by a discerning governess who, of course, is based on Mary herself. The governess educates them in correct moral behaviour by telling them stories in which animals personify good and bad traits. Pigs representing gluttony, for instance. It makes grim reading by modern standards. Some of the human characters go mad and die of grief, and it's much more pious than any of her other books. But Johnson agreed to publish it with illustrations by a young engraver he employed called William Blake. For the next 4 years she worked for Johnson, through the momentous years from 1788 to 1792. Mostly her work was translations. This was remarkable, as her French was rudimentary and her knowledge of other languages non-existent. But somehow she managed it. When she was asked to translate from German, for example, she simply borrowed a grammar from Johnson and learned the language as she went along. Understandably, some of these translations contained more of her own ideas than the original authors. Her own work she published anonymously. The Female Reader was a series of improving extracts in prose and verse to be read aloud by young girls and then memorised. But she became a book reviewer for a periodical called the Analytical Review. Inevitably, she was given the books by female authors to review. Most of them were romantic fiction, and predictably she hated them. They were full of false sentimentality, and most of them simply trash. She longed for a writer who didn't follow the herd, or voice commonplace opinions, but there didn't seem to be one, apart of course from herself. She felt a liberated woman, and symbolised it in the clothes she wore. Spurning high fashion, she wore a gown of coarse cotton with worsted stockings and wore her hair loose around her shoulders instead of being pinned up as respectable ladies did. But the fact was, the book reviewing brought in little money, and she was soon in debt again, borrowing money from Johnson this time. Indeed, he became a sort of father confessor to her, listening to her patiently when she got into one of her depressive states and poured out her woes to him. Although 30 now, she still spurned the idea of marriage and reacted with horror when she received a sort of proposal through an intermediary. How dare a man threaten her independence? and yet she still seemed to have hankered after a relationship with a man, if it could be based on genuine equality. Lonely, she took into her lodgings a 7-year-old motherless girl who she tried to bring up as a child of nature. The girl proved a disappointment, and when Mary caught her stealing sugar, she palmed her off to an acquaintance. Johnson was a sociable man and held regular dinners for a select circle of writers, artists and intellectuals. Mary was usually the only woman at these affairs. Some of the men she already knew, like Dr. Price. Others she met for the first time. Apart from Blake, another young poet named William Wordsworth attended occasionally. More important to her was a radical writer just back from America named Thomas Paine. In fact, most of the attendees were radicals of some kind, freethinkers, sometimes atheists, believers in reason, progress and enlightenment. One of the men invited was a dissenting minister turned philosopher called William Godwin. But although he was to become her husband, he was not the man she was attracted to. Instead, she fell heavily for the painter Henry Fuseli. Fuseli was much older than she was and had a notorious reputation, but that didn't deter her. He was a man who'd actually met Rousseau. He would be her father and lover combined, her soulmate. She visited his house and studio and went to the theatre with him. Whether it ever went further than that, no one knows, but eventually Fuseli grew tired of her. He was suspicious of strong women, and anyway, he had a wife already. In the end, Mary is to be left humiliated. By this time, sensational news had come from Paris. The Bastille had fallen, and the revolution had begun. All the members of Johnson's circle were enthusiastic for it, except Mary. Once again, she took her own line and was much more cautious. She was only finally forced off the fence by the growing conservative backlash. She completely rejected the idea of Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, and was furious that he dared to attack her beloved Dr. Price. Now she knew which side she was on, and she decided to sit down and write a savage review of Burke's book. Johnson persuaded her instead to write a pamphlet, and it was published as A Vindication of the Rights of Men, which anticipates in its title and many of its ideas Tom Paine's much more famous Rights of Man, published a few months later. Particularly interesting about the pamphlet is her attack on Burke's attitude to women, which points forward to her later masterpiece. Burke had jeered at the market women who forced the royal family to move back from Versailles to Paris, calling them the vilest of women. I suppose you've never met women who have to work for a living, selling vegetables or fish because they've been denied an education, she wrote angrily. Burke's romantic attitude to Marie Antoinette also infuriated her. Like all men, you've been corrupted by glamour, she wrote. To her, the Queen of France was hardly a real woman at all, but a vacuous doll, another Lady Kingsborough. The Vindication sold for 1 6, half the price of Burke's book, and was an immediate success, or well, a moderate success, although all reviewers assumed a man had written it. So a second edition was published, this time with Mary's name on it. She sent a copy to the blue-stocking historian, Catherine Macaulay, who was delighted to find another woman who held her radical views. Some men were also impressed, but most were not. Horace Walpole famously called Mary a hyena in petticoats. Even Godwin didn't much like it for its carelessness and bad grammar. Soon it was to be completely eclipsed by Tom Paine's book. But Mary was famous or notorious enough by now to have her portrait painted. She brooded on what she should write next. The Rights of Man was proving an enormous success, but what about the rights of woman? Didn't her sex have rights? In revolutionary France, apparently not. She studied a translation of the new French Constitution. This listed the categories who were not active citizens and couldn't vote: paupers, beggars, vagabonds, servants, debtors, bankrupts, and women. Women could not have a share in the government or control over property, apparently, because it would be a reversal of nature. But was this really nature, she wondered, or was it because women were being artificially kept down by being denied education? If women received the same education as boys, they could become as independent as men were. And then what might they accomplish? Furious at the degradation which her sex seemed routinely to suffer, Mary now sat down to write another vindication, but this time a much longer book, 87,000 words long. This time, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It took her 3 months to write and came out early in 1792, and of course it was to immortalise her. It's important to understand what the vindication is and what it isn't. It isn't, in the modern sense of the word, a feminist book. That the very word feminism was yet to be coined. Mary didn't specifically say that men and women were equal, although she certainly implied it, nor was she interested in getting the vote for women or women acquiring political power, which was so important for later generations. She was realistic enough to see that if society was to be reformed, men would have to do it. In a reasoned and philosophical way, she was stating that the way women were treated was not in male interests, and that if the ideals of the French revolutionaries and their British supporters were ever to be realised, that treatment had to change. After all, everyone agreed that the education of the younger generation was vitally important for the establishment of liberty, equality and fraternity. And who had the greatest influence on that generation? Their mothers, of course. But how could women, half the human race, fulfil their proper role as long as they were denied true freedom? And that freedom could only come about through education. The way women had traditionally been taught to behave had to change. In traditional society, as Mary well knew, intellectual training for girls was discouraged. They were taught to be frivolous and coquettish, all their efforts geared to snaring a man and making a suitable marriage. She recognised that by using their sexuality, women could gain a certain power over men, but what was the use of that when they ended up virtually as a slave of their husband in the traditional kind of marriage? There had to be a different kind of relationship between the sexes based on equality. Women should not use their sexual power to entrap men, and men should not tyrannise over women. The love between them should be chaste. Mary was, at this stage, anything but an advocate of sexual liberation, and that also differentiated her from many later feminists. She recognised that the difficulty was that traditionally women had been regarded as having a fundamentally different psychology from men. They were the weaker vessel, a prey to their emotions, incapable of abstract reasoning. This was the justification for their inferiority. Mary rejected the notion entirely. Men and women were psychologically identical. This meant going against her great hero Rousseau. In Emile, Rousseau had taught that girls should be modest and always defer to men. Any public role for women was a sign of degeneracy. Essentially, women existed for men's pleasure and convenience. Their education should teach them to suppress any higher ambitions and concentrate on cultivating their beauty by their dress, by agreeable gestures, and by a pleasant modulation of their voice. To Mary, this was absolute anathema. Boys and girls should be given exactly the same education, at first at home and then at public schools from the age of 5 to 9. Only in this way would women fulfil their proper role as wives and mothers. But if they chose not to marry at all, that was their right. Why shouldn't women have careers if they wanted to? It made no sense that women could be nurses and yet were not allowed to be doctors. But Mary didn't emphasise this. She still saw women primarily in terms of home and family. Although never coming near to having the impact of Paine's Rights of Man, Mary's book had a considerable success. Women up and down the country liked the ideas in it, and of course, but so did many men. Johnson produced a second edition, and it was published in America and in French and German translations. Delighted, Mary planned to write a second volume, which he was never destined to do. Gradually, the backlash against it built up. Mothers accused it of corrupting their daughters. Girls were abandoning ladylike pursuits in favour of fox hunting, learning Greek, dissecting their pets, or challenging men to duels. Inevitably, there were spoof versions. The Vindication of the Rights of Brutes suggested liberty for animals would be next, leading to them going wild and starting to attack people, particularly women. Conservative writers like Hannah More denounced the book, and her book sold in vast quantities, which the Vindication never did. It never really entered public consciousness or became part of the radical tradition in the way that Payne's book did. So, although a minor celebrity, Mary soon found herself back in the grind of churning out book reviews. Surely she did now deserve more. She deserved better. And, as we'll see next time, her life was about to totally change. Thank you very much.